Welcome to episode 13 of The Culinary Citizen, a gastronomic guide to international relations. This is Sam Chappell-Sokol.
And Kelsey Marr. Each week we introduce you to a concept or theme connecting food and people around the world. This week we're going to discuss Grenoble's School of Management's e-course we featured on our Facebook several weeks ago called Geopolitics of Hospitality.
By e-course, we mean, of course, a MOOC. That is the modern day version of mass learning. It's a massive open online course, I think is the acronym. This has been running via Future Learn, which is a company I don't know much about, but they're running it through the Grenoble School of Management. At the time of the recording, we are in the middle of our third week of studies. We'll probably publish this in the fourth week. From the beginning, the objectives for the course have been to gain a better understanding of international relations through the study of interpersonal relationships, something that we believe belongs within the realm of culinary diplomacy. This is why we're taking the course. We're supposed to deepen our knowledge of geopolitics and learn more about hospitality as an exercise in soft power, to gain insights into cultural and intercultural issues, and to learn how mundane tasks can affect the vision people have of the world. We have been comparing various lifestyles and quote-unquote surprising cultural practices and habits. I guess that's surprising depending on where you're from and your own background. To learn more a little bit about gastrodiplomacy, culinary diplomacy, which we don't have to tell you, we believe, and now more people are believing, it's a rising discipline in public diplomacy. And also something that at least on my part, I don't know as much about, which is broadening my vision of hospitality and the business of hospitality. We have a couple hospitality schools in the United States. I've never studied that, but this is all about being a good host, understanding what being a guest is like, but from the hotelier restaurant management perspective.
So in week one of this course, the theme was entitled A Philosophy of Food and Mood. In the second week, we learned about the anthropology of banquets. And this week, week 3, the course has focused on gastronomy. So, Sam, I'm curious, overall, what's your impression of the course so far?
So far, I think it's been pretty fascinating. Definitely looking at things that I haven't seen in American academia or in the American educational system. I obviously didn't go to a school of hospitality. I did go to a school of international relations. Nobody is talking about how culinary protocol or dining protocol or even protocol, even I went to school of law and diplomacy, there wasn't a single class on diplomatic protocol. So the fact that this is being discussed, I can infer that the system out of which it's coming, the French hospitality system, would lead to more discussions like this. So I'm excited to understand better what's happening in Europe when it comes to food, diplomacy, hospitality as a field of research. So I've been enjoying the course. The professor, Yves Chelmiel, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he's great. He engages in these videos. He interviews people. He has quite a few written lectures and stuff too. So I think that's been pretty interesting to follow. How about yourself? What do you think so far?
Yeah, I definitely enjoy the variety of, production that he's given us. Like sometimes it's a video of just him. Sometimes he's interviewing students. Sometimes the videos are students themselves and their experiences. It's also in French and English, which I have found very interesting because I can kind of listen to the French while I'm typing, but I definitely need to look here and there to get the translation.
The full meaning.
Yeah, exactly. So it's been a nice second language practice for me, as well as at the end of each week, he gives readings, which has been really awesome to have access to some of the really pertinent papers that have been written, at least according to this course.
Yeah.
And like you said, I think the lens at which he approaches the conversation has been very interesting. Like you, I'm not that familiar with the hospitality industry, at least when it comes to like the theory and the basic practices. That has been very fascinating for me to kind of see like, oh, these things I take for granted, like don't kill your guest, is actually something, a foundational point within a academic structure. So,
Right. And it goes from that basic to very complex, like protocol and the history of that can get very, very complex and very convoluted. As I brought up in one of the episodes on protocol in the commentary that imagine the seating arrangements and the complexities of seating arrangements and dining allergies and food preferences during 2014's. It wasn't officially a state dinner, but a dinner at which 50 African heads of state and the president of the United States were present. 51 heads of state in the same room. How do you deal with the protocol? And it's not just don't kill your guests. It's how does everybody sit and feel respected and feel like they're getting the food that their cultural, religious, personal preferences dictate. So I thought, we've gotten into some deep things that, right, I've never learned in an academic sphere before. So I think that was interesting.
Yeah. So let's go over the main points of each week that we've enjoyed so far, beginning in week 1.
Yeah, I think week 1 probably for me was a little more salient than for you. I have a lot of history and a lot of the politics background and was really interested about, for example, I guess I'm just going to hit on some points. None of these I'm not going to analyze in too much depth, but about protocol and dining protocols. And when I talk about protocols, I guess I talk about rules and regulations and both stated and unstated rules. Mm-hmm. And one of the points was that protocols were almost the first constitutions before there were nation states, before the modern national system congealed. There were small tribes, small groups, small areas, and they had to create protocols to keep people together, to keep peace with themselves, with their neighbors. And dining protocols are very important. As you say, don't kill your guests. What is acceptable? What is proscribed? What is necessary? And what is prohibited?
I thought it was interesting where you're going from like these small tribes to, in the course, at least this is what I understood, a lot of these prescriptive food regulations began with religion. And then that moved on to politics and nationhood. Definitely.
Right, and the progress between those, between small groups trying to, originally many of the proscriptions and prohibitions were for safety. I don't think it's controversial or I don't think it's questioned that not eating not eating pork in the Semitic religions in Islam and in Judaism was because of a health reason. You don't want to eat undercooked pork. It's not just because pigs are dirty animals. It's because it is one of the least safe animals to eat historically, as far as I know. So that religious became an in-group thing. You create a whole religion around, or that health reason became a religious reason. The religious reason gave you an in-group, and that in-group gives you necessarily an out-group. So I've written about how the in-group, out-group, or I've read a lot and written about how in-groups and out-groups, and like if you belong, you're part of our group. If you don't belong, obviously you're an outsider. And how kitchen rituals, food rituals, dining prohibitions, dining prescriptions can indicate whether you're in an in-group or in an out-group. If you eat beef, you're part of an in-group that includes much of the world, but it does not include, much of India. So that is the out-group for beef eaters or for pork eaters. Or if you eat with your elbows on the table, that's part of an in-group that doesn't include fussy British people or, conservative Americans.
Right. Or like tools. I think often when the former house I used to live in, I had roommates and we always shared meals together. At least once a week we'd have a breakfast or dinner. And my roommate, she was Chinese. And when setting the table, I would often forget she preferred chopsticks as opposed to a fork and spoon or fork and knife.
Right.
So just being aware, I guess that comes back to the respect and tolerance of the out group.
Right. Or, right, everybody's each other's out group. So,
right, exactly.
yeah, what tools you eat. We talked about levels of tables. In the class, it was like how close to the ground you sit has historically to do or anthropologically to do with safety and how quick you can get on your feet in case conflict should arise.
I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and I never really thought about that. Yeah. So we talked a lot about food conflict, food togetherness, and how disagreements or agreements can arise in the eating sphere. Like if you are sitting with somebody you don't like, or you have a political disagreement, it might come out as, oh, I like dessert. Oh, I didn't. You know, it's as simple as that. But that underlying that is the whole history of the political situation, which I thought was interesting.
So there's direct and indirect communication. I wonder if there's been some methodology that's been produced to analyze the indirect communication of dinner table talk.
Yeah. I'm sure I don't know about a methodology, but I'm sure there's been a lot of research about that.
Right. And how to analyze it when you go from one culture to another, or is there, when you move up the levels of like to diplomacy dining, is there one culture that everyone practices where you can then know for sure, even if you're from a vastly different culture, that I should feel insulted from what you just said?
Right. Yeah. Right. If there's a baseline at some level. One thing I thought was really interesting on the protocol topic and about how that can play out, how civility and incivility can play out at a very polite level. There was a discussion of salons in France, like fancy dining occasions where all the bourgeoisie would come together and chat. And there's a level of socially acceptable incivility. So there were these pun games, and you would kind of take each other on with wit, and you'd try to make fun of each other or try to out-speak someone else over dinner or over tea or over drinks. And I thought the idea of socially acceptable incivility is really interesting. When is it okay to insult someone? How is the presentation of an insult? In what situations is it acceptable?
Do you think that happens today in American, like when you go out for beers or coffee? I imagine coffee, it doesn't happen much, but...
Yeah, but in drinking, I mean, I think in drinking culture, there's mockery. There's, you make fun of someone. Yeah, and it can seem socially acceptable. It can seem a little mean-spirited, but there must be ways that are less impressive or less highfalutin maybe than the witty esprit games, the salon games that the French had. But I just thought it was interesting. Next time you go out, maybe think about what is socially acceptable incivility and then what crosses the line to be unacceptable incivility when you're just mean.
Right. And I think that also goes back to an agreed set of values of respect. And
right.
I think that has to be understood by the group. And it's really interesting that that is not really spoken about. It's just inherently understood until someone becomes embarrassed. And I think that's where those borderlines are drawn.
Right. That actually brings perfectly into another lesson. It was during week 2. It was on commensality, which is a word we've discussed on the program, dining together around the same table, and commensality and citizenship. And how does the protocol of eating at a dinner table, how does the protocol of being in a group lead to you being in that group? You learn early on how to eat, how to drink, how to be incorporated into that very small space, the dinner table. The theory presented was that is a good way to socialize people into society, whether into from a young age, into a nationhood or a citizenry, right? A political sphere or a cultural sphere.
Yeah,
and it can happen from a young age, or it can happen when somebody is entering to a new nation culture. So you learn quickly if I travel to France, which I have, I learned quickly that you don't make noise when you eat.
Mm-hmm.
You don't, you have to consume your soup out of your spoon as silently as possible. If you're taking a drink and you do that, that is terrible. That is disgusting at the dinner table.
Even when you're drinking wine or tasting wine?
Tasting wine's probably different, but that's not at the dinners. That's not at the dinner table.
Okay,
That's away from the dinner table. So at the dinner table, you don't make any noises. Eating noises are considered, where I don't think about it really unless somebody's being obnoxious in the United States. So you've learned to be French. Frenchness comes from the whole system of learned behavior sitting at a dinner table. I thought that was an interesting point.
Yeah, I've definitely actually heard about that and read about that in books about French culture. Is like the table etiquette is one of the things that makes French citizens French.
Right. Yeah. I thought this phrase, well, being pretty academic, but commensality is a vector of citizenship. It's not, of course, it's not just learning to dine at the dinner table makes you an American or makes you French or makes you Japanese, but you've learned your social mores, you've learned values, you've learned civic manners, you learn what to talk about. As you said before, you've learned how to avoid embarrassment. You learn what to not talk about. People say don't talk about politics at the dinner table. People often get in trouble doing so. So you learn that through trial and error, you learn what to avoid. You learn what are okay dinner topics. You can talk about the weather. You can talk about sports. You shouldn't talk about Donald Trump. So I think that is what goes into becoming a member of a culture, of a nation, of a group. So I thought that was interesting.
I thought the conversation among the students was pretty interesting for this chapter because the final question was, what do you think about, or does learning about food practices and food rituals make you a citizen? And it was about half and half, I feel. There was like a lot of in-betweens. But I think one student, Rashid, kind of summed up what I thought, that food teaches you socially, but it doesn't make you a citizen. That citizen is more about being politically active rather than just consuming food. I think that you can become a political actor through food, where you're promoting your national ingredients. Like I was watching the World Coffee Competition for baristas in 2015, and I was watching the Thai representative, and she was really focusing on the different ingredients that she was creating her final cocktail with. And I think there she was using food as a citizen.
Right.
And really promoting
Thainess.
Thainess of her nation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think food can be a political act, but at its base, or the consumption of food or the preparation of food is more cultural and less political. We talk about it in both a cultural and a political way on the program. To be a citizen is both a cultural and a political act as well. You are a voter. You're also a member of a nation state or of a nation culture, I guess. Those things can cross where food and citizenry apply, but I don't think it is a prerequisite. One of the points that the professor makes is that commensality may be a prerequisite for citizenship. I don't think that the political, what it means to be a citizen and what it means to sit around the dinner table, I don't think those can be so closely connected. And I think that's your point, Rashid's point.
Yeah, I definitely would agree. I think going on to like the next lesson in that chapter, which is related, it was an interview with a student named Alicia of being Indonesian and vegan, but working in hospitality and having to prepare non-vegan foods within her job as well as school. And I think it just made me think about tolerance of others when it comes to food. And what examples can you think of other examples where you have to have this tolerance for others, or where tolerance is practiced for others?
That's a good question. I think overall, all of the educational system of at least the United States and most of the world, there has to be so much tolerance, because in order for teachers and students to learn and to learn and to teach effectively, teaching is not indoctrination. So you have to be tolerant of a wide variety of points of view. So imagine being a high school teacher and some of your students, are very conservative and some of your students are very liberal, or some of your students are passionately environmental and vegan, and some of your students are their parents are work in the oil industry, so they were raised that way. You as a teacher have to be extremely tolerant and extremely open in order to not alienate any of those students, or to feel like you're taking sides. Is that get to?
I think that's a good example of just tolerance in general, but I was thinking tolerance in food, and the only example I can think of is when I host a dinner party. I usually include the spices that I've used in the meal around the table so that people could then adjust the spice of the dish that I've cooked according to their palate, because I understand that everyone has different palates. Because that's something that I just want when I go to someone else's house. Like, I love salt. I know it's a problem, but I love salt. And so I would want someone else to respect that I usually have a higher tolerance for salt when I'm over at their house.
Right. Yeah, and it's tolerance, but it's also, I think there was an episode, we didn't really write much about it, but it was on being a good guest, on being a good host. And how do you think through both of those challenges? Because it is a huge challenge to be a host. You are opening your home, or you're opening your space. You are providing food and beverage, you're providing entertainment. It's also a challenge to be a good guest and to also be tolerant of the situation in which your host has welcomed you. So if something is overspiced or undersalted, or to a degree that you can accept, it's, putting your own preferences aside and saying, okay, there are 20 of us here, if there were 20 different preferences being stated. So it's tolerance both as a host and saying, I'm going to provide extra salt on the table. I'm going to provide extra chili on the table so guests can doctor their own. But there are some chefs, there are some cooks, there are some hosts who say, the way I do it is the way I do it. And a guest has to be tolerant of that too. So it's tolerance on both sides. In hospitality, tolerance is so key, as we started. But if you're a vegan chef, if you're a personally vegan, there aren't so many restaurants that are purely vegan for you to get a job.
Right.
Or if you're, conservative Jewish, or if you're Muslim, or if you think that eating just honey, is terrible for bees. I don't know. Think about whatever your own personal preferences are. If you work in hospitality, unless you can find that one job that supports your opinions, you need to be tolerant. You need to understand that some of your guests will have different views, and that's the only way to make money, is to be a little bit tolerant. So I think it's a very important lesson for anybody going into hospitality.
Which I think is an interesting point of view, because then I would argue some of the top chefs are not tolerant of other people's views, and people seek those chefs out.
Yeah.
I would then argue maybe creating a niche could be economically viable, the better choice.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point think about any 2 or 3 star Michelin restaurant. There's not a lot of choice on that menu. Yeah. Those menus are pretty well established. There might be vegetarian option, but often there's not. There's the 12 courses, period. So that's, definitely not tolerance. There's a restaurant in DC that I used to go to, Little Cerro. It's a Thai restaurant opened by Johnny Monis, who's the chef at Comey. Really awesome Greek Turkish place. But his northern Thai place, he pretty much just says, there will be pork in these 7 dishes and it will be spicy. we won't adjust anything. Come if you want it, but don't come. Don't come and don't complain if you don't want it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a fine attitude. It's a private establishment. He is a private chef. He doesn't have to cook for everyone. But you can say, yes, he's being completely intolerant of alternative diets and alternative, folks who want an alternative menu. So, right. At the top end, you can do that. At the top end, he has lines out the door every night. So at the top end, you can create that demand.
Right.
But if you're working in the main hotel at the Four Seasons, you're going to see a lot of folks come in the door and you have to serve them all. So it depends on what your goal is.
I think that kind of ties into just talking about ethnic restaurants in cities. One of the quotes that was kind of tossed around in the course was, the number of ethnic restaurants is an indicator that makes a city global. And I think this is very interesting because Tucson, Arizona was recently nominated, or actually awarded by UNESCO as a city of gastronomy. And when I hear the interviews, I've never been to Tucson, so I'll just put that out there. But when I listen to the interviews, people are talking more about their daily habits, such as the food you'll see in the farmers markets, the dishes that they make. It's more of a mixture of different Native American tribes and their food traditions, the different regional foods of Mexico, as well as just the products that are indigenous to that area, leads to diversity. I haven't really heard anyone talk about ethnic, quote-unquote, restaurants there.
Yeah, I'd like to read. So I guess the academic who made that point was Saskia Sassen, who is a Dutch academic. I think she works at Columbia, but would like to read more about that and understand, what makes a global city? Is it a huge number of international people, which would then indicate a number of ethnic restaurants, or are there what other factors create, that urbanness or internationalness of a city? And it's an interesting question about global versus local, and how in Tucson versus in New York or San Francisco, Tucson is seems like a hyper local dining destination. San Francisco also advertises itself as being hyper local, dining from around California, but there's so much global influence too.
Right.
So what makes a scene local makes a scene global? What makes a food local or global? I think that fits nicely into the conversation we've had with people like Paul Rockauer about nation branding, place branding. Paul's talked about para-diplomacy, which is the concept of diplomacy on a regional level. So the brand California, or, Tucson as International Food City, or Sacramento, the work you've been doing on, Taste of Place and creating that as a food city. So thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that, at least I felt in this course, it seems like the national agenda is opposing to the regional agenda when it comes to food. An example where I don't agree with this would be America. The national agenda, which someone made in the comments about her visit to Milan 2015, and how she went to the American section and she just saw a food truck that served burger and fries. That is our international label. But when you look at the International Visitor Leadership Program, the program with which I'm currently working, they're visiting local chefs and local farms, these international visitors, and realizing the regionality and specialties of different places within the United States. And I think that's becoming more of the national agenda of the United States, is highlighting those regions.
Right.
Rather than
and showing that we're not, right, it's not a hegemonous American national culinary identity. We're not just burger and fries. We are, and we're not even just New Orleans food. Like, we're not just gumbo and we're not just barbecue writ large. We are North Carolina, we're East North Carolina, we're West North Carolina, we're South Carolina, and Kansas City and Texas. And there are so many regional variations in our food that chefs are doing a huge part to promote. Food writers, Calvin Trillin, who writes for The New Yorker, has written some really great pieces about barbecue in the South and Southern foodways. And there are a lot of authors writing about Southern foodways. And that's happening. I mean, I think there's more awareness around the world of various regional cuisines, not just national cuisines. In San Francisco, we now have a Xinjiang, like Western Chinese restaurant.
Oh,
There's
cool.
a new pop-up restaurant started by a Uyghur father and son, which is even further Western Chinese. There's obviously Cantonese, there's Mandarin, there's Sichuan. I haven't seen Manchurian food, but we're starting to become aware, and we've talked about this before on the program, awareness of more and more regionality in food.
Well, I think that's the really interesting point, that regionality in the US seems very nouveau, like new. While in the course, Yves highlights that traditionalists highlight heritage. So something we see so liberal and new is actually, he sees very
Very old school and conservative.
very old school, yeah. And I think one of his illustration of traditionalists was to prevent deception of, oh, this is my heritage or your heritage. There are trademarks that are patented on certain products.
Yeah.
And I see that tons, at least here in Sacramento, is where there's this narrative of this, at least when it comes to coffee. Here's the narrative of the trip that I took to some place in Latin America or South America or Africa where I gathered the beans. This is what the farmer and his family is like. These are the tastes on the palate that you're going to get. It's this whole narrative just to trademark this one coffee bean and one coffee, cup of coffee that I'm getting.
And I think that's very old world is the AOC, Appellation Origine Contrôlée, I think, or the DOC, I don't know the Italian for DOC, but regions that are protected by law. You can't. The easiest example is Champagne is from the region of Champagne. If you make Champagne in Burgundy, it's not Champagne. If you make a sparkling wine in the method of Champagne in the Loire, it's not Champagne because Champagne is specific. And that is codified. That is a legal part of the old world system where that's going on in Italy and Spain and France and Germany. And we're only just discovering that now in the United States. So it seems so local and hip and cool and new, but it is super conservative. The Camembert producers of Normandy, it's an old guild of people defending that method and that style of cheese for decades, for centuries. So that's not hip, that's not cool. But if we in the United States, if we in California created a new style of cheese and we're like, yeah, this is going to be like protected by the government, that would be considered pretty new, pretty special.
Yeah. I think when it comes to the patenting of a product, I think the only specification, it's not the methodology, which is really interesting because that goes to UNESCO. Like their methodology of certain food products is where you can get on the intangible heritage list. I think methodology can be reproduced. It's the terroir and the weather that creates like a certain camembert in France versus a camembert that you'll get in like Lincoln, California. The taste will be different.
Right. You can make something with the exact same style, same process, same method, but it's going to be completely different because the cows are eating different things. The cows are different themselves. The weather is different. So,
and I think when we think of these certifications of certain locations, certain products, we get in our mind what certain products should taste like. And that's not necessarily true when you go traveling. So my version of like a camembert or brie from the American point of view is very different than the camembert or brie you're going to get in France.
Right.
And the class talks about this as the ghost of taste or the travel of taste.
Right. I never heard that phrase. I assume it comes from French as a kind of an awkward translation, the ghost of taste.
Can you explain what that is?
I think so. It's a marketing ploy, or it's a subconscious marketing ploy, maybe, where we envision, or not in your mind's eye, but on your mind's palate, you're picturing or tasting what a product will be like based on your experience or based on the marketing of it. So if you think about going to Normandy and eating fresh, like raw camembert, you might have a vision or a mental imagination. You might have a mental image in your brain of what that it will taste like. It'll be creamy, it'll be rich, it'll be mushroomy, it'll be all these words. And that's the ghost of taste. Is that actually what you go and taste? Or is that what you're imagining that taste will be like? And how much of that has been the brand itself? Or if you open that coffee that you're talking about, you read those words, it says it's going to be fruity, it says it's going to be floral, it says it's from a high elevation, shade-grown village in Panama by a small family grower. You've already imagined what this coffee is going to taste like, and you have never even tasted it. And then when you taste it, how much of what you eat, or how much of what you taste, is based on the packaging, and how much is actually what you're drinking? I think that happens every day to us.
Yes. I definitely agree. They did mention more of the marketing aspect, and when I thought of the marketing aspect, I think of like falafel at Trader Joe's. Every time I go, I'm always tempted by the thought of buying those frozen falafel because they're like green, and I'm like, oh yeah, like there's definitely herbs in there, and that's what I'm really going to taste because that's what I associate with falafel.
Right.
But instead, I get a lot doughier tastes and the fried tastes. And that's where, when I thought of this, melancholy set in for someone who travels a lot or for someone who has lived in different regions of the world. Trying to recreate the tastes of a past memory in the current location in which you live. And I thought this was totally applicable with quote-unquote ethnic restaurants. These people are trying to recreate recipes in a new location, maybe to relive where they relive a memory in which they used to live, like a place. But also, it's not the same, not only because of ingredients, but also oftentimes they'll try to change the menus to fit the palates of the local community in which they now live.
Right. And I think we've talked about the documentary Search for General Tso's Chicken,
yes, yeah.
and how the history of American Chinese food is very different than the history of Chinese food. And I think that one of the phrases that was mentioned in the episode in the class was like, this is a quest for authenticity. That if you're a traveler or you're a chef, you're on a quest for authenticity. You're also on a quest for memory, as you say. It's like they also mentioned the Marcel Proust, the Madeleine, which is the most iconic food image. Trying to remember a food from your childhood, trying to recreate that. If you try to cook it again, will it be the same, or are you imagining it as you tasted it first as a child? Are you imagining something at first as you tasted it like on a riverboat in the Mekong? That fish dish will never be the same if you cook it in your like suburban or small urban kitchen. And I think, I don't know, I don't know what that has to do with diplomacy, but it has to do with nation branding, and it has to do with each of our expectations when we travel and when we cook and when we eat.
Right, and how these little Sebastians of countries, or these quote ethnic restaurants in our hometown, are sometimes what leverages us to explore different nations, which is kind of like the basis of the Thai program for nation
Right.
branding. And that's where I thought it was really fascinating how the class discussed then the environmental bubble that tourists explore a country, where they kind of eat something authentic when they're in that country, but they're not going to explore two different dishes,
They're
dishes
not
that
going to
are
push their boundaries too much.
right, exactly, by exploring different meats or something that's very outside of their palate by spice or bitterness. And I think that's interesting because then I came into question my own choices when it came to travel. Where are situations where I haven't tried something, mainly blood sausage?
Mm.
At least that's what comes to immediate mind. But I don't necessarily taste it because that doesn't sound too appealing to me.
Right. So it's a self-protectionism during travel to figure out what is your limit. And we each have our own limits. Some people say, yeah, put it in front of me and I'll eat it. It sounds like JJ, for example, who we interviewed a few episodes ago, would probably just say, yeah, whatever, put it in front of me and I'll eat it. And if I don't like it, I don't like it, but at least I experienced it. Most travelers aren't as lowercase c Catholic, like open to tasting everything as JJ is, I assume. We each have our limits, and if blood sausage is put in front of you at a small cafe in France, it's never going to be easier. A friend of mine likes to say this. It's never going to be easier for you to try it, but still sometimes it's like, it doesn't sound appetizing. I don't need that quote unquote authentic experience because I can also have the authentic experience of eating steak frite, which is also a very French dish. But that's well within your comfort zone. So as a tourist, where do you, the listener, or you, Kelsey, or I, fall on that? How far out of your comfort zone are you willing to go? But I also think, how much of a foreign cuisine is the stereotypical, oh, they eat dog, oh, they eat grasshopper. I don't know. I think
Yeah.
about, like, cuisine is a bell curve. It's like the majority of a cuisine is like rice or flour or starch, potatoes, things that are within everybody's realm of comfort. Not everybody's realm of comfort, but they're comfort foods. A majority of what I eat is like bread and cheese. Cheese might push people's boundaries, but foods that are very basic. Whereas at the fringes, yes, I might eat some weird, funky fermented thing, or peanut butter turns some people off in different cultures. But if you're talking about a cuisine that, like, oh my God, they eat blood sausage, or they eat dog, or they eat grasshoppers, or they eat other kinds of bugs,
Right.
that's probably not the staple of their diet. That's probably the thing that we as, like, outsiders say, like, oh my God, that's crazy that they do that there. They're so different than me. But those might be the fringes of the cuisine. It might be banquet food. It might be once a year food. How often do you go out for cricket tacos if you're actually in Oaxaca? I don't know. I actually don't know. It could be every day, but
Right. And as soon as you mentioned cricket tacos, I was like, oh man, you're in the Mission and there's a cricket taco place.
I know, and I've been.
I'm so
They're
jealous.
grasshoppers,
I
but
wanna
they're
go.
delicious. But is it that, like, that desire for the other that makes me think, oh my God, all of Oaxacan food is grasshopper tacos? That's what they eat. They're so weird there. But that's one of the many proteins that they put on tacos in Oaxaca. So it's not as if I can distill the whole cuisine to being that's weird. You know?
Well, that's what I think, which is a topic we can talk about further in another episode, is responsible citizen diplomacy through food fetishes.
Yeah,
where I
sure.
would say, like, cricket tacos or insect tacos are fetishized. Thank you. Example of Mexican food where, as a responsible American going to Mexico, for example, what kind of pictures am I taking of the culture? Am I just, I'm thinking of Instagram because in the international education world, oftentimes when people go on these missionary trips or short-term trips, they'll take pictures of them in a village with kids smiling, and it's like the traditional mockery, at least in that field, is like,
right.
What kind of impact are you making?
Right.
So as like responsible travelers, how can we give a full picture when we do travel of a cuisine? Are we taking pictures of the rice and bread and potatoes in addition to the cricket tacos? Or are we just
right.
trying to get all the likes through cricket tacos?
Right. Right. And in our own mind, do we distill a cuisine to its fetishistic, like, extreme?
Mm-hmm.
It's a really good question. I think we can do a whole episode on fetishizing food and social media and like Andrew Zimmern type of bizarre foods dining, where he goes all around the world and eats the weirdest thing, and everybody, it's like, oh, good. What is Andrew going to eat next? He sees him. I mean, that's a different topic. Maybe we can get Andrew on the show sometime.
Right.
I met him a few years ago, and he sees himself not just doing that. That's to get people to watch his show, but he uses that as an entree into, let's talk about anthropology, let's talk about culture. I'm actually using fermented shark in Iceland to learn more about the history of Icelandic cuisine and why fermented shark is part of the cuisine. Mm. It's not just like disgust factor, gross. It's like, let's talk about Icelandic cuisine.
But then how many of us go to Iceland wanting that fermented shark, and that's where we stop?
Right. And we don't even think about, why is that fermented shark?
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
I think it's been an interesting class. Next week, what are we talking about next week?
Okay, so we're talking about gastrodiplomacy and world order, which is about national technological capabilities, how nations advertise food.
Huh. So yeah, more of the nation branding stuff, probably pretty pertinent to our conversations on this program. Yeah, we'll see what happens. We'll probably be publishing this around the same time, and maybe we can get some feedback from other students and see if people have heard this or want to engage on it. If not, that's cool. Kelsey and I like to talk.
Yep.
So.
And totally learn new lenses of this same topic. It just seems like there are more and more things to talk about as we delve deeper. Right.
And I really appreciated this European perspective. I spoke with a colleague who is European. I won't name her, who has been taking this class and says that it bleeds French. It is so French to her. And that there's a parade of award, degreed people and awarded people, and the MOF, the Maître Ouvrier de France, like the chefs with the distinction of being the highest regarded chefs in France, and how there's so much weight put on titles in this course. And I hadn't even come close to noticing that because I'm not deeply ensconced in the French academic world.
Same here. I hadn't noticed.
So I think it's an interesting point. I'll be noticing that. I'll be looking for it in the fourth week. I don't know if it bothers me as much as it would bother a French student.
Is she French?
No.
Okay.
I think that was interesting, and yeah, I just look forward to seeing the next episode, especially since it's about gastrodiplomacy. Maybe we can get some. If Paul's been following along, maybe we can get some quotes from him. I don't know where he is these days. But yeah, there's a lot more we talked about in the class. We talked about gender and cooking. We talked about division of labor in kitchens, cooperation and cooperation in cooking, and how communities cooking together to feed visitors leads to cooperation. I think we can talk about conflict resolution when it comes to that. There's a lot more, many more lenses that we talked about as you mentioned. For now, I think we've covered a lot of what the course went over. And thank you all. Thank you, Eve and Anna and the people involved in Future Learn and all the course and all that stuff. That's been interesting. Thank you all guests for making it through this. This might have been a bit random sounding because we're both taking this course. And if you haven't taken it, it might just sound like we're talking about random topics, but hopefully it sums up or brings together some of the things we've been talking about over the past few months on this podcast. Thank you all for listening, for keeping up with us. As always, you can connect with us on our Facebook page. We are The Culinary Citizen. We are on iTunes. Every single episode gets pushed to iTunes. I learned recently that iTunes doesn't allow you to see how many listeners or subscribers or whatever you have. So the only metric to understand how many people listen on iTunes is the review. So if you happen to be on iTunes listening and you like what you hear, if you don't like what you hear, you could leave a review too. That's fine. But if you like what you hear, especially, you should leave a review and tell us that. If you ever want to reach us, feel free to send an email to Sam and or Kelsey, culinarycitizen@gmail.com. Look us up, Kelsey J. Marr and Culinary Diplo on Twitter. We hope to hear from you. We look forward to engaging with you. So thanks again, and until next time.